Vladimir Putin just met with his US counterpart in Alaska, and he looked cool, calm, collected. He didn't look worried at all. But back in Moscow, things aren't looking so good. Increasingly, it looks like the FSB is preparing for a purge. And it certainly looks like Russia's security chiefs are hunting down their domestic enemies. And that's pretty easy to do these days because the list of suspects is obviously going to just keep growing as the definition of treason widens by the day. Even your normal colleagues can be recasted as targets. But that's why in Russia, there's a fear. Even generals know to expect that one night they might get that midnight call, that midnight knock on the door. So what's going ahead is going to get worse, though, because within Russia as a whole, it's becoming destabilized. The war is simply collapsing their economy. They can't deliver what they need to. And now, with the addition of Ukrainian drone strikes, it's getting even worse. So the Federal Security Service, the FSB, its primary mission is very clearly not that of protecting the Russian state. It is not even that of making sure that Russia wins in the war. Its primary objective is consolidating power to make sure that they are able to purge the rivals and to take power, even after Putin. So as they fight over the limited resources that Russia has left, this situation gets more and more complex. Because not only is Russia losing on the front in Ukraine, it's also bleeding out due to knife fighting back in Moscow. So if we look at what this means, what's going to come next, we can assume that the Russians are not prepared. We already see that they can't keep up with the decay that is currently occurring. The burning refineries, the budgets that are shrinking, the mobilization that's stalling. We see the increased number of people vanishing. People who are important just disappearing. And they usually try to hide that away as being something that's under investigation. But we all know the case. The fact is, the situation is bad. And in fact, fear is spreading. But that fear might be good for controlling the country for a period of time, but it will not actually help you to hold a defensive line in Ukraine. So ultimately, today, what we see happening is that paranoia is spreading. And that paranoia is spreading at the highest levels as well. And that paranoia breaks the chain of commands. So looking ahead, what do we see? We see that Russia is fighting two wars. One against Ukraine. But then it's fighting another war. And that's a war against its very self. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post. And as you know, my academic background is my master's and PhD were actually written specifically on the topic of the Putin regime. And I've been living in the former Soviet states for many years now, including here in Ukraine for more than a decade. I formerly lived in Kyrgyzstan for 4 years and in Moldova for a few years, and I was all over the place, including Russia. However, due to my active work for the democratic opposition to Putin, I was blacklisted for life already back in 2010. So today, Moscow is becoming more and more unstable. And there's very clear signs of that. Some of the signs you might see is the increasing numbers of people taking their money out of the banks. Another sign might be the fact that there's so many people trying to leave the country still, including people from the elite class. But there's something else going on there. And that is that the state is doing everything it can to crack down on people, to make sure that they have total control, that nobody can resist them. But there's another part of the story that we don't often hear about in the press, which is that these crackdowns, these people vying for power, they have names. The power struggle today is among three figures, and they are consuming the state's resources due to their own desires to protect themselves, to assure their own ability to survive the end of Putin. Because no matter what happens, Putin will not live forever. And even if they got along with him very well in this life, once he's gone, there's nobody left to protect them. So let's take a look at that today. Let's look at exactly who these guys are and what this means. And I think you'll see very quickly that things in Russia are even more complicated than you might have thought. But first, just do me one favor. Please like this video and please subscribe to this channel and consider becoming a channel member today. Incredibly enough, I thank all of you who have subscribed, and I appreciate it, especially in this moment, most especially in this moment, Because as you know, Ukraine's future is being negotiated, and more people have to have the truth of what is really happening here in Ukraine, but also what's really happening inside of Russia. Incredibly enough, the press almost never talks about these things, and in fact, what we'll discuss today is virtually never in the Western press. But once you know this, you'll understand all the better, and others will understand better why it is certain that Ukraine can win. We just have to keep the pressure on Moscow. So, thank you, all of you who have subscribed. We're just less than 200,000 subscribers in less than 3 months. And it'd be really just great if we're able to make that. We're just shy of it. So please subscribe. So let's go through these guys and figure out what's going on here. And I think you'll see yourself that it's complicated, to say the very least. So one of the most important figures is a guy named Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of the Security Council. Now, what's interesting about Patrushev is that he's a longtime friend of Putin's. They're personal friends. They come from intelligence backgrounds and have been friends for many decades. But he's also known to do things that would help him. For instance, weaponizing audits to make sure they can sideline his opponents, to pull out governors, to pull out generals, and to find excuses, whether it's corruption or sabotage, to make sure that he can keep his people at the top positions and nobody else is able to rise up. This isn't very good for countries at war, and you'd like to see the best people rise up. But what you'll notice in Russia, the more you study it, is there is absolutely nobody who cares or is interested in what is good for Russia. Everybody is doing what's good for them. Now, something about Patrushev that's definitely worth mentioning is that his son, Minister of Agriculture, is considered to be the likely successor to Putin. And it's a very reasonable argument. If you read his background and you know who he is, it would make a lot of sense. Because, one, he is from the Putin family, let's say, a decades-long friend. He's someone who's Putin has known quite literally his entire life. And he's somebody who is considered to be serious. He's very corrupt, but he's serious. And so he would have a fighting chance of that. But one of the things with these oligarchs is that they all have self-interest. I realize that if tomorrow my opponent takes power, that means he's going to undoubtedly liquidate me and my family and take all of our assets. So if you're smart, what you're doing all the time in a system like Putin's is you're gaming. You're looking to how you better position yourself to guarantee that you will survive, even if the boss, Putin, is no longer there to protect you. So the other people in the FSB, which now has a divided loyalty, the security service has different groups or factions. The other guy, though, who's very important, is Viktor Zolotov. So Viktor, he's in charge of the National Guard, Rosguardia, and that is sort of a parallel army to the army. But they're also competing with them. They're competing with them about who gets things like shells or vehicles. But his first priority at the end of the day, and what he's really there for, is to make sure that Moscow is defended. Not really there to help with Ukraine. Now, what's very interesting about him, though, if you recall, when Prigozhin had his uprising just a couple of years ago, on that beautiful day, when Prigozhin decided to start riding towards Moscow, something interesting happened. This Rosguardia, it didn't save Putin. Sort of like the Chechens, who for years have kept men in Moscow specifically there to, if necessary, come out and start firing on the public. Well, those Chechens, when they face an actual uprising, an actual reason they come to the streets, they chose not to confront Prigozhin. In fact, it took over 5 or 6 hours, and they could not seem to make it about 140 kilometers, 100 miles. It just was very slow cars, I guess. No, the reality is that they realized this could be the end of the Putin regime, and they thought, do I really want to be on the wrong side of history? That won't work out well for me. So they lied low. Now, another guy who is very, very important, the third guy of our three musketeers, is Igor Sechin. Now, he's the head of Rosneft, which, as you know, is obviously dealing with oil. So he's in charge of making sure that everything at the refineries works the way it does. But he also makes sure that a lot of money goes into his pocket. But aside from that, he's also in charge of working with the security services to make sure that things like oil can be trafficked illegally and against sanctions abroad. So he's in charge of rerouting the money, setting up the subsidies, setting up the other bank accounts in other countries, paying off allies. Ultimately, he's in charge of a lot of money-related issues. Now, he's got a lot of stress these days. because his refineries, they're not doing so well. Ukrainian drones are paying them a visit, more upon more. And that's something that's causing a lot of stress because everybody was getting a cut from the oil industry. The FSB we see is under tension. They are a criminal organization. We should be abundantly clear about that. They are quite literally a mafia. They work with organized crime in Russia and abroad to engage in criminality. They are delinquents. But one of the trades they've always liked the most was the oil one. But that's become very difficult. There's less of it. The price of Ural's crude has gone down, and there's less money and less rackets within Russia. Historically, they could always take a percentage of every contract with the government. But if there's less and less contracts, less and less purchases they can get a percentage of, how do they keep people loyal to them? How do they assure that their subordinates won't cut them out of a deal? And the only way to do that is to make sure they get money. But if there's less of it, that's a problem. So Ukraine's successful strikes on the refineries are forcing bans at this point of even gasoline from Russia. Until the end of this month, in fact, it's illegal to export gasoline. Russia has significant problems domestically, and so they have less of a pie to divvy up. But Ukraine, it's successfully exploiting this chaos. So this story is just sort of incredible. Ukraine, in fact, just broke a record the day before yesterday. A Ukrainian sniper hit a target that was 3.8 kilometers, 2.4 miles away. And what's incredible about this was he used a drone to figure out where the target was, and they used artificial intelligence to then plan the attack, and he successfully struck his opponent. So while the Ukrainians are having these advances on the battlefield, and it's a very small one, I understand, but it's impressive. It broke a record. It's even more incredible is that the Russians aren't thinking about this. They're not talking about this. They do talk about the deep strikes by the drones, because those are disrupting everything. It's sort of like the attack that just happened at the chemical plant down in Stavropol. That was a big deal, because that means that munitions for the Russian military cannot be produced. The Russian supply chain is not just stressed, it's totally devolved. And Ukraine is cutting that supply chain. In fact, just look at the important, very important attack that just occurred. The Ukrainians went after the Iranian drones, the Iranian parts, the Iranian shells. They're coming in by boat. And how so? Ukraine is able to prevent the Russians from getting things that they critically need for this war. But it goes beyond that. We see that the FSB is doing things like making more and more people use the state's chat messenger. It's called Max. And what's absurd about that is not only does it really not work very well, is that it also is so very obviously an attempt just to collect information, to spy on their own citizens. And you might think, like, what's the point of that? Or what's the point with just the arrest they had? In the case of Belarus, Russia and Belarus are extremely similar. They are the unified state. They work directly together. But they just had a 78-year-old woman, Nina Bashinskaya, who is labeled as an extremist and a criminal. What did she do? She said she likes peace. She likes democracy. And now they are going to turn her life upside down. And you think, but really, what's the point of that? Like Max, and I'll explain what the point of that is. It's just to create more fear in the population. Because the more people that are scared, the more that they're focused on what will happen to them next, the less they pay attention to where's all this money going? Why is it that we don't get more from the oil companies? People aren't paying attention to that. And people know very bad things can happen if they ask those sorts of questions. And so they don't. But at this point, there's another thing going on here that's very important. We see that there's a lot of indicators and indicators that you should look for in the coming days. So there's been a incredibly high number, disproportionately high number of governors and vice governors who've been arrested in the recent past few weeks. Something is going on there. Something very important is going on there because it also corresponds to people in the military having their careers end. There's something about to happen, but there's something else happening. We see that there's more and more growth within Roskvardia, which is the National Guard. That's one run by Zolotov. And that's very interesting because you would think that he, given this, the fact he has his own little private military company, the National Guard, he would feel very secure. But he doesn't. Because at this point, he realizes that everybody identifies him as just being a Putin lackey. So ultimately, if push comes to shove, Would his own soldiers even do what he asked them? Or would they be able to be bought off by somebody else if they realize that Putin is no longer there to protect them? So looking ahead, check this out. I think in the next few days, in the next couple of weeks, you will see something very interesting happen. You will see that there are very destabilizing things occurring within Russia. You will see that the fight now for resources is simply gotten out of control. There's not a lot of options. And that's why I think you'll see extremely soon, remember this, is that there is a good chance that within Russia, we will see so much push, so much tumult from within, that one day we might wake up and learn that the Russians have decided they want to sue for peace very quickly. And it's simply because they don't have an ideological shift of heart, but because they realize that at home, their own problems are simply getting out of control. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. And as always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.